Hello, welcome to this ESS revision video on Introduction to Biodiversity, topic 3.1. And today we're looking at types of biodiversity in this relatively short video. So you need to know that there are different types of biodiversity and this can affect what we should conserve. So for example, here we've got grey squirrels. They mainly live in one place in the UK. They have very low levels of genetic diversity and their numbers are relatively low. Foxes live across Europe. They've got a higher genetic diversity and they've got a higher number. So the the seals are much more endangered here, and the real area for concern is this low level of genetic diversity, because even if you allow them to reproduce, they may have very similar genetics. So if a change in the environment arises, that could cause them to face extinction regardless of the numbers. So there are three levels of diversity that you need to know about. So on the lowest level, you've got genetic diversity or genetic biodiversity, or sometimes called the gene pool. And this is the range of genetic materials that are in a species. So for example, if in a classroom, you're all the same species, you're all humans, however, we all have different properties. And therefore that shows us genetic diversity within the area. And this is really important because it can be used to make breeds, and that can be in animals like these cows here, or in plants. And we can have breeds that are important. Like for plants, we can get the same species, but have different breeds or varieties that are resistant to drought, for example, or new diseases. So having variation is important because it means hopefully a species won't be wiped out by a disease. So that is really important, and it allows us to adapt to those changes. Some feel that it is interfering with succession if we maintain high genetic diversity, because later in succession diversity actually drops as all species become climax community ones. So species diversity then is what we normally focus on, and this is, as you should know from the Simpsons Diversity Index, a mixture of species richness, the number of species found. So for example, if you had cats, dogs and mice, that would be 3 species, and that would be your species richness. If the other part, however, is species evenness, so if you had 10 cats, 1 dog and 1 mouse, that would be a lower species evenness than if you had 10 of each species. So in this picture here, you may have here, even if you both had, for both of these pictures, even if there was 10 species in both of these pictures, then you can tell that this one has got the higher species evenness, because you can see all the different species. This habitat is dominated by the grass species, and therefore it's got a low species evenness. Then we have the final level, habitat biodiversity, and this is the range of habitats in an ecosystem. So the UK has many common habitats, and that means we've got a high range of biodiversity and habitat biodiversity. However, if you went to a desert, there may just be that 1 or 2 types, and therefore a lower range. And this is important. So all this biodiversity, whether it's genetic, species or habitat level, is important because basically the more complex an area, the more biodiversity there is, the more habitat diversity there is, the higher the stability of that ecosystem. And that is because if you removed one of the pathways from a stable ecosystem, a complex ecosystem, it would have less of an impact. So if in the rainforest, which is one of the most complex ecosystems we have, if you took out this frog here, for example, not many other species would probably notice it. Whereas if it's in a less complex ecosystem, that frog would more likely. So an example of this could be being resilient to flood, drought and disease if things happen. A tundra is a very simple system, as you can see here, with very small amount of plant life and very few animals. So the removal of one species here might have a bigger impact because most of the species have a large niche in the habitat, whereas a more complex habitat, your niche is likely to be less important and more smaller. Sometimes biodiversity, however, doesn't give rise to healthy habitats. So if it's biodiverse but because of habitat fragmentation, that's a bad thing. It can only occur due to management of habitats sometimes, and that can cause problems. And some stable ecosystems actually have lower amounts of biodiversity. Now, where the biodiversity is found around the world is often is mainly along the equator. So if you think about where the sort of equator is for Earth, and then think about where all the life is, you're talking in this region here, which is the tropical regions. Now, the reason you get more life in these regions is because we have a lot of insolation in this area, which is sunlight hitting the land or the sea, and therefore you get higher temperatures. If you get higher temperatures, you get higher rates of decay. If you get higher rates of decay, you get more nutrients in the soil, and because it's because it's tropical, you get more water, and therefore basically it allows the start of the ecosystem to be more successful. Plants do more photosynthesis, and the most important groups of species in the hotspots are plants because they start the food chain and they provide habitats. Now, these areas are often thin strips of land which are often close to human areas, and they have a lot of resources in them. So they're particularly endangered because they are prone to human resource usage. And often in these you get endemic species, which means they only occur in one area of the habitat. Now, in terms of global biodiversity, they have a huge number of species, and I said a lot of them are this word here, which is endemic. And an endemic species means they only live in that one area. So if that area is destroyed, they don't live anywhere else in the world. So you can see here these different areas, you don't need to know the names, and how many of the species are actually endemic from the total plant list here. So hotspots have a high area of endemicness, and therefore we need to preserve them, because if this area is destroyed, then that species would be wiped off the planet.